Yep, says I'm live. Yep, says I'm live, so I'm gonna bash on that. I was just watching somebody else's podcast and I thought, why waste my time doing that when I can finish this book? And I want to read it, so it's interesting. No dog in the background. I went out, grabbed some wood, and it's quite a warm day today though, so a lot of rain last night, some flooding out there, but nothing to worry about for me. And hello, Riff. My little dog River here, trying to get up on me. Anyways, I just thought that I'm gonna carry on then with. We've got this thing slayed pretty well, and it's gonna. This is chapter 11, and it's called Media Lies. Well, we did have two people. I mean, how hard is it to give me a thumbs up there, people? Pretty hard, I guess. Okay, so chapter 11, The Media Lies, Kevin Weeks' book, Brutal, the untold story of his life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob. So there were a lot of things that brought out Jimmy's violent nature, but the one that never failed to enrage us was the name Howie Carr, a piece of shit reporter. I called him Howie Coward because he hid behind the computer at the Boston Herald and the microphone of his Boston radio talk show, writing and speaking words he would never dare say in person, one-on-one, to whoever he was writing or talking about. Lots of reporters and radio hosts write and speak untrue and nasty things, but Howie never had a good word to say about anybody. His radio show attracts the same crowd as Jerry Springer. As far as I'm concerned, Howie Carr and his big mouth have no journalistic value. He's just one of those loudmouths who like to dig up dirt on people and invoke controversy, or as they'd say in England, controversy. Jimmy certainly wasn't the only one who Howie attacked with his computer. In one of his hate-filled, vindictive, venomous columns for the Herald, he wrote about Vinny Mancuso, an 18-year-old kid from Southie whose mother was suing the city of Boston because the cop who shot her son on May 16, 1986, was drunk when he killed Vinny. I knew Vinny, who was a car thief but was never violent. Joe Quinn, the cop who shot him, was referred to on the street as Cuckoo Quinn. He claimed Vinny came at him with a knife, yet somehow Vinny ended up with a bullet in the back of his head as he tried to run away. After that, Quinn retired from the police force and eventually died. In his column, Carr called Vinny a member of the FFA, Future Felons of America. Very funny, making fun of a dead kid. It's not right to take a cheap shot. It's not right to take cheap shots at people in every column. If you have a problem with someone, say it to his face, but that's not Howie Coward's way. He prefers to creep behind closed doors and write stories in which people who understand what's going on can see he is not even close to being on target. He should have been a writer for a supermarket tabloid. Oh, my cutie pie rib. Like so many other reporters, Howie is big on using the little catchwords like alleged or reputed or sources say, so he can get away with anything he wants to say. His own personal life could be material for another hate radio talk show. Maybe they could talk about his first marriage and how it ended in divorce. My greatest revenge is knowing that this guy has to look in the mirror every day and see he is a coward. And the rest of the day, he gets to live the life of a coward. In the late 1980s, when Howie was working at Channel 56 in Boston, Jack Hines, one of his co-workers at the television station, stopped by the liquor store. "Why doesn't Howie ever come in here?" I asked Jack. "The coward drives by here 3 or 4 days a week just to get a look at us. You tell Howie that if he comes in, we got a fresh dumpster out back waiting for him, just like with Robin Benedict." I was referring to a high-priced call girl who was killed by a college professor in 1984. Benedict's body was disposed of in a dumpster. One afternoon, probably 5 years after that, Jimmy, Stevie, and I were standing outside the liquor store. Howie pulled up in a blue foreign sports car across the street from where the three of us were standing. The minute I spotted him, I walked between Jimmy and Stevie and started running across the street. As the blue car took off, a puff of black smoke rose out of the tailpipe. The next day, sitting safely behind his keyboard at the Herald, Howie wrote an article about Jimmy standing outside the liquor store, referring to him as a diminutive weightlifter. Jimmy read the article and just laughed at the coward's latest column. "He didn't have the balls to get out of the car to face you," he said, "and now he's going to write about us." Over the years, Howie has made a career of writing about Bulgers every chance he gets, even if the article has nothing. Yeah, there's a missing word. See, sometimes I think I'm stumbling over words, but it's because there's a word missing. Even if the article has nothing to with either, see, it should be to do with either Jimmy or Billy, he puts them in. Without this subject, he would have little to talk or write about. His hatred of Jimmy and Billy probably started with Billy, who never was the darling of the press. Jimmy told me that once when Billy was talking to an elderly lady, Howie tried to interrupt, asking him repeatedly, "Can I ask you a question, Mr. President?" Billy, who knew exactly who Howie was, turned around and said, "Who are you?" I'm I'm from the press," Howie answered him. "Well, do you vote in my district?" Billy asked him. Uh, when Howie said no, Billy told him, "Well, you just wait until I'm through talking to my constituents. Then I'll talk to you." Howie never waited. Jimmy, however, did make some serious attempts to get together with Howie. One in particular was at Howie's house in Acton. Uh, Jimmy and I staked out the house, driving by a few times to take pictures of it and to get the layout. The reason for our visit was simple. We were looking to kill him. We didn't like him because he was a piece of shit who wrote nasty stories about people. The guy was an oxygen thief who didn't deserve the right to breathe. Jimmy's first plan was to fill a basketball with C4 and blow it up the second Howie came out of his house. His second plan was to wrap a detonation cord around a tree in front of his house when Howie was home. The cord, a quarter of an inch thick, would contain C4. When it exploded, it would take the tree down, which would take down the house, but both plans had too much risk of killing Howie's kids, so we had to pass on them. My idea was to just shoot him. So one day I went down to his house at 5 in the morning and lay in the gravel or in the graveyard across the street. I was holding a high-powered rifle with a scope on it, waiting until he came out. Somewhere between 7 and 7:30, Howie walked out of his house holding the hand of his daughter, who was probably around 7 or 8. There was no way I was going to kill him in front of his daughter or take a chance of hurting her, so I passed on it. I would have liked another chance to finish the job, but Jimmy got busy with some other stuff and told me to forget about him. Even though Carr is a maggot and a piece of shit, if we had killed him, he would have been like Alan Berg, the Denver radio talk show host assassinated by a white supremacist with a MAC-10 as he got into his Volkswagen. Law enforcement would never have stopped until they tracked down Carr's killer, just the way they did with Berg's. His brother would have been an attack on the system, like his murder would have been an attack on the system, like attacking freedom of press, the fabric of American way of life, and they would have spared no expense to solve the crime. But in the long run, Jimmy and I got sidetracked and the maggot lived. Still, I wish we had killed him. No question about it. Really, eh? To the day, I bet, yeah. Yeah, I said, Howie, be fucking nice. In November '99, Howie came to my arraignment. When I was walking by him, he said, do you have anything to say? Yeah, I said, Howie, be fucking nice. In his column the next day, he wrote that Howie, be nice. He couldn't even get those 4 words right. Okay, I was later informed they would be calling Howie Carr as a witness at my bail hearing. However, he didn't get the chance to offer his thoughts about how dangerous I might be to him. So, since I didn't go for a bail hearing. Another reporter who earned Jimmy's wrath was Paul Corsetti, also from the Boston Herald, disgusted with the articles Corsetti was writing about him. Jimmy found out where Corsetti hung out and drank. One night in the early 1980s, dressed in a suit, Jimmy had me drop him off at the Dockside Restaurant and Bar at Faneuil Hall. While I stayed outside the car, Jimmy went in to find the Herald reporter. When he saw Corsetti sitting at the bar, Jimmy went over and said, Do you know who I am? Corsetti said no. I'm Jimmy Bulger, Jimmy told him. And if you continue to write shit about me, I'm going to uh, blow your fucking head off. The next day, Corsetti reported at the meeting to the Boston police. He was issued a pistol permit within 24 hours. The cop who gave him the permit told him, "I'm glad my last name is not Corsetti." A couple days later, Jimmy found out about the scene with the cop and was glad to hear about how uncomfortable it had made Corsetti. But Corsetti was just one more example of Herald reporters who report stories that are inaccurate. These reporters are not the only members of the media who are careful never to allow the truth to get in the way of a good story. The story about the state trooper Billy Johnson was another perfect example of this tactic. The story began in September 1987 when Jimmy had me pick him up and Teresa to take them to the airport. They were planning to fly to Montreal to visit Teresa's daughter, Kevin, who was married to the hockey player Chris Nyland. It was around 5 in the afternoon, but by the time we got to the airport, Jimmy was already in a bad mood. We'd been halfway there when Teresa had realized she'd forgotten her license and birth certificate, so we had to go back for them. He started screaming and yelling and was plenty aggravated when we finally arrived at Logan. Once we got inside the terminal, I walked him down to the check-in counter. While we were in line, he put his bag on the conveyor to the x-ray machine. A security woman saw the bag, grabbed it, and said, "You have a large amount of money in here. I'll have to take a look." Immediately, Jimmy grabbed the bag out of her hand and said, "Fuck this shit. I'm not going anywhere." She promptly called security, and when a security guard arrived, he started to go after Jimmy. Walking a good way behind Jimmy, I banged into the security guard and knocked him over the counter. At that moment, Jimmy was trying to take off his money belt, but he had a knot in it. And as he was trying to pull the belt off, the knot kept getting tighter around his waist. Calling out, "Kevin!" Jimmy finally snapped the money belt off and handed it to me. This was the only the mistake he made. This was the only. See, they didn't need the word "the" there. This was the only mistake he made. Actually, in all years we were together, that was the only mistake I ever saw him make. Well, we heard he made a mistake walking down the stairs and he didn't have the safety off the pistol or take it off and was trying to pull the trigger. It's not going to work. But his calling out Kevin gave the authorities my identity. Knowing who Jimmy was, they could easily figure out by my physical description that he was calling Kevin Weeks, not Kevin O'Neill. When I headed out of the airport, one of the security guards tried to follow me through the revolving doors. As I stepped out, Jimmy stuck his foot into the door, trapping the guard inside the middle of the door. Walking across the street, I saw 2 state troopers who had parked a car in front of mine. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" I said calmly to them. "Yeah, it is," one of the troopers answered. Then I got into the black Chevy and drove away. As I pulled out the airport, I put on the police scanner and drove back to the variety store. There was nothing on the scanner about the Logan incident. Back at the airport, the officials found that both Jimmy and Teresa had less than $10,000, the specified amount a passenger is allowed to carry. "You can't fucking hold me," Jimmy told them. "You've got nothing on me." As it turned out, even though the officials could have made up any charge they wanted, said he assaulted a guard or charged him with disorderly conduct and made him go to court. They didn't charge him with anything. A couple of hours after I left, after a lot more swearing from Jimmy, the official released the two of them. When I met Jimmy down at the variety store that night, I gave him back the $80,000 in the money belt. But the media screwed up the simple facts of that case. Both Howie Carr and Peter Galzini's report that Jimmy had a suitcase filled with $500,000 that he was trying to bring into Montreal. But the inaccurate facts didn't stop there. On September 25th, 1998, William Johnson, the state trooper who had initially detained Jimmy and Teresa, committed suicide in a New Hampshire field. The media tried to blame the trooper's death on Jimmy, insisting that Billy Bulger, who was the president of the Massachusetts State Senate, had taken revenge on Johnson by demoting him. But that simply wasn't true. Other troopers told me the guy had mental health issues. Even though the trooper had plenty of problems before he met Jimmy, it made a much better story to link his suicide to the scene at Logan 11 years earlier. Most of the time, the Boston Globe wasn't as inaccurate as the Herald. They just knocked the people from Southie during busing. They also like to describe me in all sorts of stories as Whitey's surrogate son. Another example of the media putting labels on people they wrote about. Jimmy and I were friends, not like father and son. Even though he was the boss, he always treated me equally like an associate, not a son. The reporter who seemed to do the best research and put real effort into getting the story without having been there was Shelley Murphy, who had to be the Herald, who had been at the Herald for 10 years when she went to work for the Globe in 1993. But Jimmy and I usually just ended up laughing at most of the news stories. As time and time again, the media had it wrong, over and over, holding to their pledge to never let the truth get in the way of a good story. When Jimmy and I, along with two of our friends, won the lottery, the press had another field day. The truth of the story is that in December 1990, Jimmy and I walked into the liquor store and saw a friend of ours, Pat Linsky, buying Mass Millions season tickets. When Jimmy asked him what he was doing, Patty said he was buying tickets as extra Christmas gifts in case he forgot friends and people who worked down at his store. Jimmy and I offered to help him pay for the tickets, but he said, "No, I have it." During that week, the three of us gave out the tickets to friends and relatives as last-minute gifts, telling everyone in a more or less joking manner, "If you win, we're partners." But no one ever expected to win. Almost 8 months later, on July 26th, I was up in New Hampshire with family playing golf for the week. When I got back to the liquor store that weekend, I got a call from Pat saying that his brother Michael had hit the lottery for $14.3 million. That night, Patty and I met Michael, who said to Patty, "We're partners." Patty told Michael he was partners with me and Jimmy, and Michael said, "I don't care what you do with your 50%. I know what I'm doing with mine." So Michael got 50%, and Patty, Jimmy, and I shared the other 50%, with the three of us, which is decent, receiving $119,000 apiece. I thought it was more than that, but That's another story that's well known. At that time, there was no love between Jimmy and Joe Maloney, the state treasurer. Actually, if Danny Aiello and Jerry Cooney, a one-time heavyweight contender, made it, their son would look just like Jerry Malone. Joey had the machine at the liquor store taken out. At the lottery headquarters, they checked their machine, and all the balls that were used to draw the numbers were weighed to see if we had somehow rigged it. It was a waste of time. The drawing was legit. As at a press conference, Joey said that the only winner who could have caused him moral trouble would have been his mother. The press was certain that somehow Billy had put the fix in for his brother and that it was all a part of an after the win scheme to launder dirty money. Again, they were wrong. But the truth also was that it caused us more heat than it was worth. So once again, bad people getting good, eh? They won the lottery. So the media also worked hard trying to make up stories about Ginny's sexual orientation. But, doesn't the guy realize it's all a psyop? It's intentional to make them not be heroes, to denigrate them. But there wasn't any truth to any of those stories. One photo of Ginny that often appears in the press shows him bare-chested except for a vest, wearing a cowboy hat and holding a gun. It's supposed to equate him with the village people. Like, get real. When he really was with a woman. The photo was taken when he and Teresa were on vacation and they went into a vintage costume place where you put on old-fashioned garb and you have your photo taken. They never show the part of the photos where Teresa is dressed as a saloon girl. It's just easier for the press to take Jimmy's part of the picture out of context and leave Teresa out of it. Actually, Teresa had a couple photos and won't release it. She said she's saving it for when she writes her book. Despite their continuous attempt to grab pictures of us, Jimmy and I were pretty alert and managed to avoid nearly every photographer who hounded us. There is one photo of the two of us, however, the continually accompanies articles about either one of us and is usually shown on the Whitey Bulger episodes of America's Most Wanted. This one was taken by a Globe reporter who happened to stumble across the two of us one summer day when Jimmy and I were walking around Castle Island. I was wearing a white t-shirt with the Fila across its front, and Jimmy had on a Boston Red Sox cap. That's the most famous one. The minute we spotted the photographer with his foot-long telescopic lens stretched out across the roof of his car, Jimmy and I both gave him dirty looks. Then, as I started running toward him, the photographer jumped into his car and took off. For all the years the photographers hounded us, that was the one of only two photographs they ever got of the two of us together. There was one incident, however, in which Jimmy and I managed to use the media to further our interests. In 1990, when we were interested in the race for the governor of Massachusetts and were anxious to do whatever we could to hurt the campaign of the lieutenant governor, Francis Bellotti. Jimmy had never liked Bellotti and particularly blamed him for the failed investigation into the fire that took place at the Herald Vendome on June 17, 1972. During the fire, 9 firemen lost their lives when the southeast section of the hotel collapsed. Jimmy always believed that the investigation was whitewashed because Franchi Construction which was doing the renovations of the hotel, was a political contributor to Bellotti. It had been reported that some of the support beams were illegally taken out and should never have been removed during the renovation. Jimmy and I were told by the firefighters who went into the hotel the night of the fire that the building wasn't structurally sound to begin with. Bellotti had always been after Jimmy, making it a personal matter, trying to embarrass Billy's political career through his brother. So Jimmy was determined to do whatever he could to make sure that Bellotti didn't get his party's nomination in the race for the governor. During the campaign, Jimmy and I used to go around town and along the expressway at night, spreading our particular message of "Remember John Cody" on sidewalks. Late at night, I hung over the overpass or climbed the walls, spray painting in fluorescent orange and black the places where the cars went by with the words "Remember John Cody," while Jimmy waited in the car. John Cody had been the Deputy Revenue Department Commissioner in 1982 when Bellotti's office probed the Revenue Department. During Bellotti's investigation, a street tax examiner, Stanley Barchak, made allegations against Cody. 7 weeks after Barchak's testimony on July 30th, 1982, Cody committed suicide in his North Andover home. Many people believed Cody had done nothing wrong and that Bellotti's relentless pursuit had made an innocent man commit suicide. Our campaign to discredit Bellotti may well have ended up costing him votes. A week before the election, people started to talk about Cody, and the Globe wrote stories about the graffiti appearing all over town. It was enough to stimulate the media's interest in John Cody, even though I think I gotta sneeze. Oh my, excuse me. Oh, sorry. Gesundheit. Now, a week before the election, people started to talk about John Cody, and the Globe wrote stories about the graffiti appearing all over town. It was enough to stimulate the media's interest in John Cody, even though they had no idea or that Jimmy and I were behind the whole scene. But for the most part, the media devoted far too much space to printing lies about Jimmy and me. I assumed that people would prefer to stay private. Whoop. Yeah, this is entertaining now. Stay private rather than have their names in the newspaper. We were no different. Oh my Lord. So dusty in here with the dogs. That's only 35 minutes. Oh my Lord. That was the end of that chapter. Page 212. I saw somebody was watching, but they went off, I gotta say. That's funny. So yeah, but you know, as much as he goes on about the media, if you watch the media in this day and age, you know it's like they're hand in hand with the government. And I'm sure back in the day, it was of course, the local police departments worked hand in hand with the newspapers of the day, the Boston papers, right? So, yeah, they do it intentionally. They don't want to make Whitey Bulger out to be a cool guy. They want to, like say stuff like he's got AIDS or whatever, or he's gay or whatever the scenario is, right? So it's by design. Now, hopefully I'll be able to carry on with this chapter here. Maybe I'll just leave my smoke for a bit here. I wanted to do at least another, do an hour today because I really want to get this book done. I'm on to page 213 now. I'm still enjoying the warmth of the fire. Hopefully I'm over my little sneezing. I don't have a cold or anything. It's just kind of dusty. It's a lot of ash from the fire, or just like when you open it up and whatnot. Anyways, I'm going to bash on with chapter 12. In the Wind, it's called. 1994 to 96. I was standing by the end of the counter next to the lottery machine at Rotary Liquors at 295 Old Colony Avenue. The store we'd bought from Stippo 10 years earlier when John Connolly walked in. It was around 3 in the afternoon on Tuesday, December 23rd, 1994. Connolly, who modeled his appearance after John Gotti, was wearing an expensive suit and tie, his hair carefully coiffed, dressed as sharply as when he'd been an FBI agent. He'd retired from the FBI in 1990 and now was working as a head of corporate security at Boston Edison, a nice benefit from his years at the FBI. Although I'd seen him riding around South Boston, he rarely came into the variety store next door where I usually worked. If he was looking for Jimmy, he'd go to the liquor store, but most of the time he'd be talking to Kevin O'Neill. Is the other guy around? He asked this time, referring to, of course, to Jimmy. He looked a little anxious, like he had something on his mind. But I told him Jimmy wasn't around. When he asked for Stevie, I told him he wasn't around either. We made some small talk, and before he said, then I've got to talk to you. The two of us headed down to the walk-in beer chest and walked inside. This was the perfect place for a private conversation since it would be hard to bug because of the dampness, along with the humming of the fans, and the whirring noise of the compressors. And we would also be out of sight of anybody hanging around down there. The indictments are imminent, he told me as soon as I closed the door to the chest. That wasn't exactly a surprise. We'd known for months that a grand jury had been sitting in Worcester considering the extortion of the Jewish bookmaker like Chico Krantz and Jimmy Katz, who were paying rent, another word for protection money, to Jimmy and Stevie. We knew the indictments would be for bookmaking, extortion, gambling, and money laundering. They're trying to put them all together over the holidays, Connolly continued. That way they can pinch them all at once. That made sense. Stevie would be at his mother's and Jimmy at Teresa's over the holidays. They could scoop them up, both up, and whoever else might be around visiting their families on the same night. Obviously, they were trying to put together whoever else was named in the indictment. Indictments in position over the holidays and arrest them. But I wasn't certain exactly who the others might be, and I wasn't worried about my involvement in the case since I had nothing to do with the Jewish bookmakers. I also knew that for the past year or two, Jimmy and Stevie had been receiving weekly updates about a couple of extensions. They knew what people were saying from their sources in law enforcement, as well as from people who had been summoned there. They had held the grand jury out in Worcester to try and cut down on leaks, but it wasn't working. In all the information that they were getting, my name had never been mentioned. Jimmy knew the whole cast of characters involved, the bookmakers and everyone else the grand jury was targeting, as well as the witnesses they were calling in. And he'd been maintaining a lower profile than before. Normally, Jimmy was pretty elusive, but he'd been even more so for the past year and a half. He'd also been taking more trips than usual and getting out of town when the heat was turned up. In 93 and 94, before the pinches came down, Stevie and Jimmy were traveling through the French and Italian Riviera. The two of them traveled all over Europe, sometimes separating for a while. They'd be gone 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Sometimes they took girls, sometimes just the two of them went. They would rent cars and travel all through Europe. It was more preparation than anything, getting ready for another life. They didn't ask me to go, not that I would have wanted to. Jimmy had prepared for the run for years. He'd established a whole other person, Thomas Baxter, with a complete ID and credit cards in that name. He'd even joined an association under Baxter's name, building an entire portfolio on the guy. He'd always said, you have to be ready to take off on a short notice, and he was. Now that guy, I understand, was like some homeless guy that he helped, an alcoholic guy that he helped. And when he died, he stole his identity, something like that. But don't quote me, wouldn't want to be misquoted. I'm going to stick to the book. Carrying on, Stevie, however, was, as usual, all over the place. He wasn't curtailing any of his activities or anything. Over the past 2 years, Jimmy had been especially upset with Stevie's traveling back and forth to Cambridge and Brookline, meeting with Frank Salami at the Busy Bee restaurant. Frank went back to the 1960s with Stevie and had made successful bid in the late 1980s to take over the New England Mafia. Recently, however, Frankie had taken off, and after he and his son got indicted for some scam in Hollywood on a movie production. But for years before Frankie went on the lam, Stevie had headed to the other side of town during the day and then come back over to meet with us in Southie around 4:30 in the afternoon. Jimmy kept saying, "What are you doing? You're over there with him and then you come over to us. You make it look like one big gang and you're the liaison between Frankie and us. You're making us one big target." "No way, Jimmy," Stevie said. "I'm just on top of things." "Are you making money with this guy?" Jimmy asked him. "Do you have anything going with him?" "No," Stevie said. "Then why are you over there?" "We're friends," Stevie told him. "Yeah, well, they're getting pictures of you and Frankie together, and then the feds are taking pictures of you leaving and meeting with us here," Jimmy said. But it had been useless for Jimmy to talk to Stevie. He continued moving around, not changing any of his activities just because a grand jury was investigating him. Stevie wasn't as keenly attuned to the law as the two of us were. Many times they were on him for days and he didn't have a clue. One October afternoon in 1994, a few months before the indictments, Stevie picked me up at the variety store just to take a ride, and I hopped into the car with him. We drove downtown toward Andrew Square and took a left onto Boston Street. As we did, I turned the visor down so I could look in the mirror and immediately picked up 4 cars following us: a van, a Trans Am, a red Camaro, and a Ford LTD. We hadn't gone more than 3 blocks from the store when I picked up the law was behind us. As we pulled into a gas station on Columbia Road, 2 of the cars started to pull over, one across the street from us, one behind us, while the other 2 kept circling up and down the block. "Look at those cars, Stevie," I said as I pointed out all 4 to him. "Holy shit," he said. "I didn't see one of them." You have good eyes," I said. I said nothing. He drove me back to the store. I got out. Only 4 people in the FBI office know about this indictment. Connolly went on to tell me that December afternoon in the beer chest, he'd heard it from Dennis O'Callahan, the SAC or supervising agent in charge of the Boston office. "So where are Stevie and Jimmy?" After I talked to Connolly for a while to make sure I had it right, I told him I'd beat Jimmy and try to get a hold of him. By then it was 3:30. When Connolly left, I went next door to the variety store and beat Jimmy. He called me back a couple minutes later and told me he was going shopping with Teresa. I told him to swing by and pick me up. In a few minutes, he picked me up in his blue Ford LTD, and I got into the back seat, and the 3 of us drove to Neiman Marcus in Copley Plaza, always aware the car might be bugged. I didn't say a word about the indictments or Connolly while we were in the car. When we got to Copley Plaza, Jimmy told Teresa he was going to talk to me. She stood by the entrance to the Neiman Marcus while Jimmy and I walked towards the back of the car, which he had parked illegally at the sidewalk. I told him exactly what Connolly had told me. There was no change in his facial expression as I explained how O'Callahan had told Connolly that the feds had plans to arrest him and Stevie over the holidays, and how only 4 people in the FBI office knew that. Have you gotten hold of Stevie yet? He asked me, and I told him no, that he was the first one I had called. He said he'd call Stevie and I should too. Then he called over to Teresa, who was still standing in front of the Neiman Marcus. The two of them talked privately for a few minutes, and then the 3 of us drove off, and he dropped me off at Preble Street near the variety store. I'll call you later, he said before the 2 of them took off, and I went into the store. I realized he might be gone for a while. Things were changing. Around 5:30, Stevie finally showed up at the variety store. He looked the same way as always: black leather jacket, black gloves, dungarees. I told him the same thing I told Jimmy. Jimmy hadn't reached him, so it was the first time he had heard about it. I also told him that Jimmy had already gone. Stevie didn't seem panicked. My guy is right on top of it, he told me. I'll be hearing from him. He left the store, assuring me he had plenty of time. I repeated that only 4 people knew him, and that maybe his guy wasn't one of them. A week later, Stevie came back in the store and said to him, "What are you doing, Stevie? You've got to take off." "My guy is right on top of it," he told me again. "Stevie, I told you there are only 4 guys who know. Take off for a couple weeks. If anything come down, you've got a head start. If nothing happens, you had a vacation." Stevie got a little upset, and we started arguing. He kept telling me his guy knew everything, and I was telling him there was only 4 people who knew. Finally, he said he had a couple of things to do, and then he would take off. I heard nothing from Jimmy that week or the next, but I felt more interest in me. Obviously, since I was the only one left in South Boston, I continued doing my loan sharking and my usual business activities, but there was no ignoring the stronger presence of the law. Before the indictment, Jimmy and I always joked about the FBI agent John Gamble, a former Winchester weatherman, 6'8" with black hair, thick glasses, with oversized black rims and a black mustache, a mustache, a real geeky kind of guy who always wore the same brown trench coat and tried to blend into a crowd, but he looked like a huge bookworm, a big goof. At Castle Island, Jimmy and I would watch him and laughing because he stood out like a giraffe walking among people. We also knew that since the grand jury had first been convened, they had round-the-clock surveillance on us. There were 3 different teams, each one working 8 hours on us. We got to know lots of their faces. It didn't matter how many different cars they drove. We remembered their faces. South Boston is a small community, so it wasn't that hard to spot the undercover cops. People overestimate the law. They figure that once they're on you, you can't do anything, but that's not true. It's not that they're so great as what they do at what they do, but it's just that the criminals can be lazy at what they do. And if a criminal makes one mistake, he's gone. Most criminals don't put enough effort into not getting caught, being caught. The law, uh, the law can make 1,000 mistakes, and they will get their check every week. Yeah, that's right. And time is always on their side. They all have the time. They all have all. They have all the time in the world. But I'd gotten really good at losing the law whenever I wanted to. Jeez, I'd ho- I'd hop on the T, go one or two stops, then hop on another T or train and go a few more stops before getting off and getting on into a waiting car. Or I'd make my way through the projects on foot, snake through a few buildings and tunnels, come out the other side and jump into a car I'd parked there earlier. Or I would drive down a one-way street, hop out, and have another car waiting. When they had a plane on me, I would drive to Logan Airport where there was restricted airspace and their plane couldn't follow me. Sometimes Jimmy and I would be flying down the highway in the left high speed lane, and we'd suddenly swing over 3 lanes and fly off an exit at high speed. Other times we'd be in the right lane on the highway going 25 miles per hour. Anyone who is behind you, who is not following you, would get upset and swing by and pass you. But the lawyer would slow down and try and stay behind you at a distance, or they'd get ahead of you and wait at a rest area for you to pass. Jesus, those were just things we learned over the years, like how the law would use magnets to try to put transmitters underneath the car's bumper, sort of an early form of LoJack. But we'd always check the bumpers and find them. Then we'd take out the battery and leave the empty transmitter in place there. When I think about all the work Jimmy and I put into not getting caught, I can barely imagine how much money we could have made legitimately, probably with a lot less effort. But with Jimmy gone, I wasn't curtailing my activities. I was basically living the same life, although without his presence. But no matter where I went, I felt the presence of the law. On Thursday night, January 5th, 1995, I was down at the L Street Tavern with my friend Bobby Cox, playing whist with some friends. This was the place I used for Goodwill Hunting, where Matt Damon always hung around. In the movie, Damon had the middle booth, but the end booth was the booth next to the jukebox. Jesus. When we walked in, anyone sitting there would get up so my friends and I could play cards at our designated card table. Anyhow, that night, Stevie's younger brother Michael walked through the door and motioned to me. As the two of us walked outside together, he told me they just pinched Stevie. What's he doing still around, Mikey? I asked him. I told him to take off 2 weeks ago. I know. Jesus, what was he thinking? He should have taken off. I know, Michael kept repeating. When I started to look around, all I could see were all sorts of new cars driving around. The faces in the cars were all staring at me as the undercover agents kept circling the bar. It was an even stronger presence than I had in the past 2 weeks since Jimmy took off. Mikey, you brought the law with you, I told him as I started to point out the circling cars to him. Just look at them. I'll catch you later. I walked into the bar, grabbed my jacket, and walked outside the door. A friend met me at L and 7th Streets and gave me a ride to another friend's place. I wanted to get a hold of Jimmy and let him know what was happening. I hadn't had any reason to contact him for the past 2 weeks, but now I did. I kept beeping him from my friend's apartment in Southie at G and Broadway, and finally around midnight he called me back. How you doing? He asked. Fine, I said, but they just pinched Stevie and red's all around. Red was the universal warning sign for danger. When we used it, it meant the law was around and they're looking for someone else. I heard it on the radio, he told me. I just got back to Massachusetts, but now I'm making a U-turn. I was coming back tonight. He was probably taking Teresa home for a visit. He talked for a couple of minutes about nothing much, and then he said, "Call you later," and he was gone. As it turned out, Stevie was actually indicted on Monday, January 9th. He'd been arrested on Thursday night on a complaint, and he was charged with something just to hold him and prevent his taking off till the indictment was handed down. On January 9th, the indictment came down for Jimmy too, as well as 6 others, including Bobby DeLuca, Jimmy and Johnny Martorano, Frankie Salami and Frankie Salami Jr., and George Kaufman. Now that he'd been indicted for racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and gambling, Jimmy was officially wanted and in the wind. He was gone. Over the next 6 weeks, Jimmy and I had a lot of phone calls since he was on the lam now. He'd had to get rid of his beeper and was using calling cards at payphones to call me at numbers I would give him. I never have him call me at the same number twice. He'd always tell me exactly when he would call, and he was never a minute late with each call. I never had a number to reach him at. The next time I saw Jimmy was in the middle of February in 1995. He'd made arrangements to drop off Teresa at her daughter's Karen's house in Hingham and pick up Catherine Gregg. Teresa wasn't well suited for the life on the run, and after 2 months, she was ready to come home and see her 4 kids. Kathy was much better equipped for that kind of life. She had no kids and had been devoted to Jimmy since the early 1980s. Kathy was very intelligent and always upbeat and pleasant. A good person. She treated everybody in the same nice manner. She had 2 toy black poodles, Nikki and Gigi, that she and Jimmy loved and were always walking. Kathy was a dental hygienist, but thanks to caring for Nikki and Gigi, she'd become expert at grooming dogs as well. They had been together as long as I had known Jimmy. Kathy lived with Jimmy when he wasn't living with Teresa in a house in Squantum. In mid-February, Jimmy had made arrangements for me to meet Kathy at 7:30 p.m. at the bottom of the Golden Gate stairs that run down from the Thomas Park in South Boston. When I drove up, she was coming down the stairs. Her sister Margaret had dropped her off and taken Nikki and Gigi. Kathy gave me her usual big smile and hopped in my black Pontiac Bonneville, and we took off. I'd driven around for an hour before I met her to make sure I was clean and there was no law following me. As always, Kathy looked attractive and well put together, blonde and blue-eyed. She had a lovely smile, a pretty face, and a nice bone structure to her face, and she kept herself in good shape. That night she was wearing warm clothes, no hat, and a big smile, and carried over the shoulder type of weekend bag as her only piece of luggage. We drove around for another hour uh, to make sure neither one of us was being followed before moving or heading over to Malibu Beach in Dorchester. There were two parking lots on the beach, one on the Morrissey Boulevard side where I was to park, and the other side where Jimmy would park. Kathy and I were on the walkway heading from the Morrissey Boulevard side to the Savin Hill side about 9 when Jimmy appeared out of the shadows of the cold, clear February night. Trying to surprise us, he strode calmly out of the darkness, but Kathy saw him right away and picked up her pace. I could see a few other people around, but no one was paying us any attention. At first, Jimmy didn't show any outward emotion, but as he got closer, he gave us a wide smile. "How you doing?" he asked simply, and Kathy went right to him and gave him a big hug. The two of them embraced a long minute, making a dramatic scene, sort of like out of Casablanca. He was wearing a Stetson hat, a black leather jacket, and dark jeans. He and I shook hands, and the three of us walked over to the Savin Hill side of the parking lot. Jimmy seemed nice and relaxed and in a good mood, like he didn't have a care in the world. We got into his black Mercury Grand Marquis, me in the front with him driving and Kathy in the back, which is how we usually sat when we were out with women. We drove around South Boston and Dorchester for an hour or so just to see the town and stuff. Jimmy was joking around for a little bit, and then we talked about what was going on with the case, how Stevie was doing, and why he hadn't taken off. Jimmy had spent 9 years in prison, including a stint in Alcatraz, so he knew how hard it would be for Stevie, who'd never been in prison before. He felt that was one of the reasons Stevie hadn't fled, the fact that he had no idea what prison was like. He was worried that, left to his own devices, Stevie would self-destruct. Actually, 8 years earlier, back in '87, Jimmy had wanted to pack it in. He was approaching 60 and figured it was time to retire. He'd had enough of it all. He wasn't sure what he would do, maybe travel. He certainly didn't need any more money. It would have been fine with me, but Stevie had wanted to stay active, and Jimmy was hostage to him. Now, even though Jimmy has been gone less than 2 months, It was obvious that he was preparing to stay out as long as he had to. I know it would work for him. He'd prepared for this for years, and he had no bad habits, no vices. He didn't drink or gamble or use drugs. Things would have been different if he had did things, did any of those things. Plus, more important, he was extremely self-disciplined and and would never let his guard down. It takes a lot of money to stay out there, but I imagine he had taken care of that. Driving around that night, I did ask him if he needed money, and he said he was all set. Finally, Jim drove me back to my car, and I gave him a new phone number where he could reach me whenever he needed me. He said he'd call me. And then I got out of the car, and Jimmy and I had a handshake, and the two of them drove off. Although the indictments had been served with Jimmy, and Jimmy was officially a fugitive, I had pretty much the same routine as before, although it was less restrictive and more relaxing without him around. I'd stay home till around noon. Then I'd shower and shave and go down to the variety store around 1:30 and stay till 6 p.m. People would come down to see me and complain. I'd hear about people being bothered, kids breaking, you know, kids breaking into houses. I just want to see how many more. This house is nice to get to. And okay, well, I think I'm going to pack her in here. I'll just finish up this. I've gone over an hour. That sucks, man. I wanted to keep going on that, but I'll just keep reading. Into houses, relatives beating up family members, the basic day-to-day complaints. As I'd always done, I'd have to deal with each situation. I'd grab the people who were preying on weaker people and tell them to stop it. I'd find the guys who were robbing in Southie and send them to Newton or Wellesley. Don't go robbing your own people. I'd tell them, go to the richer towns. They have more. Parents who were having troubles with their kids would ask me to talk to the kids and help keep them out of trouble. Some kids were trying to drugs or getting into fights all the time or stealing cars. I'd go to the house or see the kids on the street or when they came into the store and tell them what you're doing is building up a record where you will end up doing time in jail. Everything you're doing is foolish. You're not making any money doing it. What you're doing, it's not worth it. I didn't have a record, but I had a reputation, and the kids might listen to me better than they would to their parents. I sponsored some basketball and hockey teams, giving money to each team so they could buy uniforms and equipment. The community wasn't as close as it had been when I was growing up. With a lot of people leaving and a lot of outsiders moving in. It was usually a tougher place now, and it wasn't easy for a kid to stay out of trouble. Lots of people were coming up to me and saying, tell him I say hi. I couldn't say okay, because if one of these people were working for the law, it would show that I had acknowledged for Jimmy's whereabouts and I had contact with him. Then law enforcement would indict me for aiding and abetting. If I saw his brother Billy, I'd say everybody is doing good, and I could draw his, and he could draw his own conclusions. I would never want to jeopardize Billy or put him in a compromising position. I considered it plausible deniability. I was saying something without saying the words. But most nights around 6, I'd leave the store, get dinner, and head and go back out afterwards. Most Tuesday nights, I'd play pool in a league for 4 hours or so. Thursday nights, I'd play cards. They were friendly games where we would enjoy the action and have some fun while killing a night. Obviously, I wasn't making as much money as before since my operation was smaller now. I still had a few drug dealers and bookmakers who were paying me or giving me a cut. I had my gambling and loan sharking business, as well as the sports business with guys working for me to take bets on football games. But after the indictments, we pulled our horns in. Things were a lot quieter on the streets in Southie. I was also visiting Stevie in Plymouth once a week at the beginning, and then maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. But he was calling me every night, asking me if I was coming up, talking about the case and walking and what was happening in court. I don't like talking on the phone at all. I was afraid he might say something accidentally on the phone where every conversation from prison was recorded. I felt like he was making me a target by calling me every day. When I visited him in Plymouth, we'd sit separated by the glass partition and talk on the phone. There would be no physical contact, despite what some of the newspaper reports said about Stevie. Things were pretty bad at Plymouth. The food was terrible, and he had lost weight. You had to remember that Plymouth was a federal holding facility where you're being detained until trial. It wasn't a state joint like Norfolk, where things were much better and you had more facilities and there were more to do to occupy your time. But Jimmy had been right about Stevie. He wasn't doing well in prison. Whenever we'd talk about Jimmy, he'd always say, "It's better for my case that the other guy is out there. Tell him to stay free." There was no doubt that the whole atmosphere of the trial and everything would be changed if Jimmy had gotten caught. It would be more of a media event than it already was. Although I was hearing from Jimmy pretty regularly, at least once a week, and often 2 or 3 times a week, I had no idea where he and Kathy were, and I wouldn't talk. I wouldn't ask. In May of 1995, he had called to ask me to meet him at the Lions in New York. So I took the Amtrak out of Dedham to Penn Station and had no trouble getting on the train without being followed. When I got to New York around 1 o'clock, I met Jimmy and Kathy at the Lions, which referred to the 2 statues of lions in front of the main branch of the New York Public Library on the corner of 41st and 5th Avenue. Kathy looked great as usual. She was still taking good care of herself and seemed as happy and pleasant as ever. Jimmy wore boots, a dark 3/4 length jacket with a drawstring at the waist, slacks and a baseball hat, sunglasses and no gloves. No change in his appearance from how he dressed in Southie. Sometimes Kathy would stand off to the side to give Jimmy and me a chance to talk privately. Mostly we talked about the case and what was happening. He was now using his ID as Thomas Baxter, and was confident about the way things were going. He'd heard from whoever else he was in contact with now that the case on him was falling apart thanks to bickering between the state police and the FBI. Also, some of the people involved in the case, like George Kaufman and Chico Krantz, were sick and might not make it to the trial. Then the three of us took a long walk, just three more assholes behind, blending in with the rest of the assholes walking along the streets of New York. We stopped at a restaurant in one of the hotels and had an early dinner. After dinner, I turned around and came back on the train again. In late June of 1995, I had to take off and get out of town for the summer. Paul Moore, a South Boston drug dealer who was paying us money, had been arrested and had started to cooperate. I had dealings with Paul and knew there was an excellent chance I would get indicted. So I took off for the summer. I went to New Hampshire to the lake, Winnepesaukee area, whatever that is, and had a great time for myself. I had three different places to stay at, including one I owned including one owned by my wife's uncle. There were reports that I wasn't around and anyone looking for me would have had a hard time finding me. I spent my days swimming off the dock, cruising around the lake in a maroon and white chaparral boat I bought with a 350 horsepower inboard-outboard motor. Since there weren't any payphones available for us in the lakes region in New Hampshire, it wasn't easy finding numbers to give to Jimmy to call me at. So I got myself a pair of hand phones, like the ones the linemen from the telephone company use, from a friend who worked for the telephone company. I'd find out the phone number of a local business. Then at night when the buildings were closed, I'd clip the handset onto a junction box on the outside of the building where the telephone line came in, and Jimmy would call me there. The building was always closed, so no one else was around, and I could talk to him as long as he wanted, usually 10 or 15 minutes. I managed to do this at maybe 4 different buildings near the lake, so the two of us could stay in touch that summer. Every once in a while, I'd sneak back into South Boston and take care of what I had to do, and then head right back up to New Hampshire. They always freak out when they hear the dog jump down, or the cat jump down. Finally, the first week in September, the superseding indictments on Jimmy and Stevie came down, but I wasn't mentioned. I came back to Boston a week later, relieved to have escaped another round. It was easier to talk to Jimmy at different payphones back in South Boston. Every time we talked, he sounded great, upbeat, and not at all worried about his case. A rolling stone gathers no moss, he would tell me, which I assumed meant he was moving around the country using calling cards in lots of different places to call me. Finally, in the spring of 1996, a year since I had seen him, he asked me to meet him again in New York at the Alliance. The purpose of the visit was simply to touch base with one another. I took the train again and had no trouble eluding the law. When I met him and Kathy at the, God, how long is this one, eh? Quite long. At the public library. They both looked great. Yeah, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. I've only been reading here for 124, so that'd be appreciated. She had natural blonde hair, but it looked like she had lightened it a bit. It was obvious he was still keeping in shape. The two of them looked completely relaxed, like they were on vacation. He wasn't one of those people who showed a lot of affection in public. He felt that was all for show. So they didn't walk around holding hands, but you could tell he cared for her. And there was no question she cared for him. It was it was a nice late May day, and the three of us walked around Bryant Park behind the library and talked about what was going on with the case and in Southie. Then he grabbed a sandwich and a tonic from a nearby sandwich shop and walked around some more. Finally, around 6, we headed back to Penn Station. Jimmy and Kathy walked me right down to the platform where the three of us shook hands and I hopped on the train and back to Boston. As always, when I was on the train, I didn't allow myself to fall asleep, feeling the need to stay awake and be aware of my surroundings. Right after that visit, I got some important news I needed to share immediately with Jimmy, but it turned out to be 5 weeks until he next contacted me. I'd only been back in Boston a few days when it got back to me that Teresa was dating that piece of shit, Alan Thistle, whoever who everybody knew was an informant for the FBI, the state police, and the Boston police. It was also well known that he was a drug user. As soon as I heard that news, I just showed up at Teresa's house on Silver Street in South Boston around 7 at night and rang the bell. Teresa seemed a little surprised to see me, but let me in. She'd always been a beautiful woman, and dressed in dungarees and long-sleeved white blouse, she looked stunning. She was around 54 or 55 with platinum white hair. Right away I said, "So what are you doing going out with Alan Thistle?" "Oh, he's with Kathy," she answered me. "I have my life to live. There's plenty of guys out there to go out with. Why him?" I said. "He's an informant for law enforcement. He's just pumping you for information." I knew Thistle worked for John Gamble, and I'd always thought that he might be wired up. Once Thistle had asked a friend of mine what kind of watch he had. If if I get enough money off the FBI, I'm going to buy a watch like that, he told my friend. Before my friend could answer, I jumped in and said, "It's a cheap one, not expensive." I didn't want him to have any info at all I knew would try and use the fact that my friend had a gold PJet in a negative manner. You must had to measure every word you said to this guy. But Jimmy took off in '94 while the investigation was going on. Thistle had approached me and another fellow and told the two of us he was getting $1,500 a month from Gamble. "Yeah, I know what he looks like," I told him. "He was always trying to follow us around." "Well, if you want to pay me too," he said, "I could be a double agent for you and Jimmy. I can let you know that you know what they're saying and what they're doing." He went on to tell me that they were bugging the benches where we sat at Castle Island. "Yeah, we're not interested," I told him. "We're not doing anything." But that night at her house, Teresa kept defending him. "Everything you tell this guy, he's going to go back and tell law enforcement." I kept repeating. I was there close to 3 hours trying to explain to her that she shouldn't go out with this guy, that he was a bad business. Finally, when I got ready to leave, she said, "Well, it's too late." "What do you mean it's too late?" I asked. She told me to come downstairs and follow her into the kitchen. In the kitchen, she lit up a cigarette. Jimmy hated her smoking, and she never smoked in front of him or me. I could see she was nervous and her hands were shaking, and she pulled out a card and handed it to me. The card said, FBI Special Agent John Gamble. As I looked at it, she said, I already talked to him. He came to my house and I told him everything. Where Jimmy and I were in New York, the name Thomas Baxter that he was using, everything. Even that she and Jimmy had stayed with a relative of mine in upstate New York. I could see she was real excited and nervous, but I needed to find out everything she had said about the 6 weeks she and Jimmy had been together on the run, especially about the ID that Jimmy had developed back in 1985 and had just started to use. All right, relax, calm down, I said gently. We were both standing up in her kitchen. If Thistle had walked in at the moment, I could have broken his jaw for him, but he didn't. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. We talked for a few more minutes, although she didn't have much more to add. Then I said, I'll get back to you, and left. Hell hath no fury like that of a woman scorned. It certainly hadn't made Teresa happy, and when Jimmy dumped her off and took off with Kathy 10 minutes later. I never talked to Teresa again after that. There was no reason to. Unfortunately, there was nothing I could do but wait for Jimmy's call. After I saw Teresa, I visited Stevie at Plymouth and told him what she had done. Since it wasn't safe to talk about most subjects on the prison phone, we both used pads of paper to write each other messages that we would hold up to the glass. After we were through with each message, we would scribble out over it in case anyone got a hold of the pieces of paper. Jimmy had always been just as concerned with writing things down. The two of us hardly ever wrote anything down, but the few times we did, we would burn the pieces of paper or rip it up into small pieces and throw it in the car, went out the car window while we were driving down the highway. You've got to reach Jimmy, Stevie wrote to me that visit, but of course there was nothing I could do for those 5 weeks except hope he didn't get caught using his Baxter alias. Finally, on July 4th weekend, he called and I told him Teresa had given him up. Thank God, at least I know, he said calmly, not sounding the least bit rattled. I'll call you back. Oh, man, this one's long. When he called back a few days later, he told me to take some pictures of his younger brother, Jackie, which he could use for a new fake ID. He also told me he'd grown a mustache, which was a big change for him, his usual clean-shaven look. So I should make sure Jackie had a mustache in the photo. I talked to him for a few minutes about taking out Alan Thistle, since Thistle was dating Teresa and was working for the FBI and everything. But he said no. Going out with Thistle would be Teresa's punishment. So I went to Jackie's house at 17 Twomey Court in South Boston with a blue cotton sheet, a phony mustache, and a Polaroid camera, and took a bunch of photos of Jackie using the blue sheet for the background. I chose the 4 best and spent a good month putting together the documentation necessary to get Jimmy a new social security number, driver's license, and a birth certificate. In August, on the night Jimmy was supposed to call me back at 8, I waited at the phone number I'd given him, but he didn't call. He was very punctual, and it wasn't like him to even be late by a minute. When he finally called me at exactly 9, I figured out that he had to be in Midwest, probably the Chicago area, with the time 1 hour behind us in the East, and he had gotten confused with the time difference. You probably know where I am now, he said. Then I told him I'd been waiting an hour. I've got an idea, I said, and told me to meet him in Chicago at Water Tower Place in 2 days and to bring the pictures of Jackie. I rented a little blue foreign car and drove out there with a girl. Pam and I were separated by then. After I had made sure there was no one following us, we swapped over. We stopped overnight in South Bend, Indiana, near Notre Dame. The next day, we met Jimmy and Kathy near Water Tower Place, a big modern building in Chicago. It was a beautiful late summer day, and the four of us first had something to eat at an outside cafe. Afterward, we walked around in downtown Chicago. The girls walked and talked together so Jimmy and I could walk alone. As always, no one recognized him. But the way I wouldn't have taken that girl with me. So I want to finish this, but man, this one's a long one, eh? Oh, there we go. We got it. Okay, so when we were walking that afternoon, Jimmy told me how he had been in Louisiana and had rented a place down there. He ended up befriending this family where the husband was kind of lazy. The guy was a carpenter by trade, so Jimmy bought him all kinds of carpenter tools, and they were such nice people that he also bought appliances to help them out. He ended up spending around 40 grand on that family. I just laughed as he told me this story. It was typical of Jimmy to do the unexpected. There he is on the run and he's taking care of other people. That's Jimmy. He also told me how he and Kathy were walking down the street in Louisiana town one afternoon, and the sheriff who was directing traffic stopped the cars to let the two of them get by. "Hi, Tom," the sheriff greeted him, as friendly as he could be. Jimmy smiled back, and he and Kathy just kept on walking. But even though Jimmy and Kathy looked terrific, and I could tell he was still working out regularly, there was a sense that things might be coming down. At one point, while the two of us were walking, he told me, "If anything ever comes down, put it on me." I said nothing in response. I didn't understand at the time why he was thinking that. I also figured he was in touch with others, although we didn't talk about it and I never knew for sure. But the IDs turned out to be all wrong. Jimmy's mustache looked nothing like the one I'd put on Jackie. The fake one was much bigger than the pencil thin one Jimmy now wore. So we went shopping and bought a Polaroid type camera and some blue sheet and headed to his hotel to take new photos. He hadn't been able to get a room in a nice hotel, so he had to settle for a crummy one. In the room, we took a bunch of photos that worked fine. He'd done his homework and had 4 new names with addresses and social security numbers, which we could use on the second set of IDs. One of the alias was Shackleton, the name of a man who he befriended in Illinois. And look at that. And, oh yeah, a man he befriended in the Illinois area and whose ID he had acquired. I have no idea how it happened. If he gave the guy money or what. He chose the photos he liked best and compared them to the size of my license picture to ensure they would fit in the frame. So once he was satisfied with them, we were ready to head out for dinner. Around 9, we walked over to a nearby Japanese restaurant. It was a warm, pleasant summer evening, and Jimmy and I wore regular slacks and shirts. Kathy, dressed in white pants and blouse and a light jacket, walked on ahead with the girl I was with. That seems weird. Why would you bring somebody, an outsider, unless she's some kind of like criminal or whatever? 3 black kids in their early 20s walked by and started to stare at the girls. They were saying something to the girls, but they were mumbling, so Jimmy and I couldn't really hear them. Jimmy burst out, "What are you looking at, you motherfuckers?" Out came his knife and out came his knife and out came my knife, and we ran right towards them. The guys took off running down the street. I didn't think the girls realized what was going on with the guys, but they saw us pull out the knives. That's Jimmy, too, on the run and still aggressive, not taking shit from anyone. We had a good laugh about that scene during the dinner. When we walked into the restaurant, Jimmy said, "Every day out there is another day I beat them. Every good meal is a meal that they can't take away from me." It was strange to talk from. It was strange talk from him, but a few minutes later, he was acting as if he didn't have a care in the world. We sat in the back of the restaurant at an ordinary table. Jimmy asked the waiter what he recommended and then checked with the 3 of us. Finally, Jimmy ordered some chicken dishes, some meat dishes, and some vegetable dishes. We had a couple of beers with the meal. It was a relaxing, pleasant meal with good food and friendly conversation. After dinner, we walked the few blocks back to his hotel. We shook hands, and I told him I'd be leaving early in the next morning. He'd said he'd give me a call. Chicago was busy, and there weren't that many hotel rooms available, but I'd gotten a room earlier that day a few blocks away from yeah, that's the last bit here. From his hotel. That room also turned out to be a shithole, even shabbier than Jimmy's. After 10 minutes, we checked out, along with the cockroaches that had their suitcases packed too. The 2 of us headed back to South Bend and spent the night in a motel on the main drag there. But the next night, we were back to Boston. Back home, I had finished the IDs and gave them to a friend I trusted to bring them to New York. There was too much heat on me to make the trip myself. While looking for Jimmy, the law had increased the surveillance on me a notch or two. But Jimmy knew I was sending someone I trusted, so it was no big deal. As it turned out, Jimmy wasn't happy with me or with the finished IDs. He'd called me to complain that there was no date of issue on the licenses. They don't put date of issues on Massachusetts license anymore, I told him. If they put on on one on and a cop stops you, he's going to pick it up right away that it's phony. He finally accepted what I said, and then we talked for a while about the case. From what both of us had heard, it looked as if the case was actually falling apart. George Kaufman, the liaison between the Jewish bookmakers and Jimmy and Stevie, had died. He'd been a real he'd been a real sweetheart, but he had a heart attack from his diabetes. At least he died of natural causes. A few months later, in mid November, Jimmy asked me to come back to New York. It took some careful arrangements, switching cars and stuff, but I was able to elude the law and take the train down. Again, I met him at the Lions. He and Kathy looked exactly the same, like two hassle-free tourists in New York. We talked about the case for a while, and I showed him my driver's license and how there was no date of issue on it. It was a cold November day, and we headed out to a restaurant in a nearby hotel. On the way, he stopped to ask a street cop for directions. Kathy stood next to him while he talked to the cop, but I moved to the other side. If the cop recognized Jim, I knew I'd have to crack him. I felt I felt a surge of adrenaline that I might have to bang this guy's this guy out so Jimmy could take off. But the cop just told us, go down a few blocks and take a left. I knew this wall was all part of Jimmy's belief that the best defense is offense. When we were walking away, he said, the best place to get lost is in a big city. People are just walking around thinking about their own problems. You don't stand out there. If he wanted to, however, he knew he could disarm people with his personality and mannerisms. Otherwise, he would terrorize them. There just wasn't much in the middle of those two sides. I had known all along, however, that it would not be easy for anyone to capture Jimmy. If he saw them coming, he would take them he would take them with him. He wouldn't hesitate. Even before he went on the run, he'd always say, let's all go to hell together. And he meant it. I also knew Jimmy wouldn't go to trial. He would rather plead out to the life sentence than to his family through the embarrassment of a trial. If he had a gun on him, he'd go out in a blaze of glory rather than spend the rest of his life in jail. But I didn't think they'll ever catch him. I'd always thought that he could end up traveling around Europe. I figured that if he ended up in Germany, there would have been a new Third Reich. If he took off for Mexico, the entire village would be speaking English. It's not like he would ever conform to them. I also knew he would be smart enough to avoid putting himself in the position of killing anybody. But then again, if anybody fucked with him, he'd kill him. Most of that day and evening in New York, however, Jimmy was upbeat and seemed to treat his life as if that day was just another adventure, one he'd been planning ahead of the for since the early 1980s. But there was Also a strange feeling, something hard to explain, but just a little bit off. The I understood that I was the only one he trusted completely. When I took back, when I look back at everything, I think he had some insight about Stevie, that he had a feeling how Stevie was going to react to everything, and that was why he was acting so different that day. At the end of our dinner, he seemed more aware of everything around him. His tone was a little more serious, and there wasn't as much joking as casual or as usual. He repeated the phrase he'd used before, that a rolling stone gathers no moss, which told me that he knew he was going to be on the move again. I got the feeling then that he was resigning himself on the fact that he wasn't coming back. Up until then, I always believed he thought there was a chance he'd beat the case. However, at that point, there was something different going on with him. I didn't fully understand all the aspects of his case. It would be another 6 months before it all came clearer. Yet at the moment, at the restaurant in New York, I sensed that he had moved to a new place in his mind. It was over. He'd never see or never return to South Boston. After dinner, the two of them walked me to Penn Station. The three of us sat in chairs and talked for over an hour as I waited for my train. When they announced my train, I got up. Jimmy walked me over to the gate where the guy took my ticket, and we shook hands. He said, "I'll be in touch." And after that, and that was that. I walked onto the train and figured he would call, but he never called again. I think about him a lot. I figure he's out of the country now. I hope they never catch him. Whoa, and that's the end of that chapter. We're on to chapter 13 next, and that's entitled The FBI and the Law. We finished up on page 236. So, wow, 236. That was a long read, that one, but almost 2 hours, Hour 52. No thumbs up, no viewers, but I'm still reading my book, so it's not like I'm not going to stop reading my book. I'll get it finished and move on to the next one. If you happen to watch this video, give us a thumbs up if you don't mind, at least one. And share this video, subscribe. I don't know. Anyways, I'll see you in the next chapter. I'm out.